Okay, we're good.
Okay, well, welcome back. We are here, Gavin and I are here to discuss material from Wrangham's Chapter 6 and 7. Chapter 6 is titled Baliev's Rule in Human Evolution. And then Chapter 7 is really where he starts getting into the meat of his ideas for self-domestication in humans. And Chapter 7 is the tyrant problem. So before we begin discussing the material in these chapters, a couple of first of all, just to remind you that for this week, we've asked you to, this is, again, for just chapter 6 and 7, we've asked you to watch two videos, which Gavin will post shortly. The first is a TED Talk, which is about 17 minutes, not long, by a historian called Yuval Noah Harari. It's really an excellent talk. It's a talk that summarizes his first book, which was called Sapiens. And this talk is titled, I believe the title is, What Explains the Rise of Humans? Why are modern Homo sapiens, that is us, why are we the only remaining humans? As we've learned in this course, there are at least 6, arguably 7 or 8 different species of humans. Homo neanderthalis, Homo erectus, Homo habilis, Homo sapiens, that's us, and specifically Homo sapiens sapiens, which refers to modern humans. But, it remains an interesting and important question, I think, from many perspectives. That is, why have modern humans, why are modern humans the only species of humans that remain today? There are a variety of different possibilities. Harari presents one series of possibilities which turn on modern humans' abilities to cooperate in large numbers for a common cause. And this is something that's quite literally second or first nature to us, but to other species is not known. So we'll not steal too much of Harari's thunder, but I think it's an important talk that I think you'll find enjoyable. He's an entertaining guy. So the second video we're going to ask you to watch is actually an interview, a relatively informal interview I believe it's at a university, so it's done by the university's communications and marketing department. It's either that or it's an interview on television. I can't recall now. At any rate, it was an interview recorded many years ago with 2 evolutionary psychologists, Martin Daly and Margot Wilson, who were married collaborators who worked together in the field of the evolutionary psychology of violence for several decades. Margot Wilson died about 10 years ago or so. And so this particular interview occurs several years before her death. But it's a really interesting and I think worthwhile interview because the questioner, the interviewer, asks many of the questions that I think any reasonable smart person, like those of you in this class, would want to know about someone taking an evolutionary perspective on violence and on homicide. So this is it's an interview that lasts about 30 minutes, but I think, once again, I think it really is worth your time. I think it helps to bring to life much of the material that you are beginning now to read about in Wrangham's book and will read about in the next few chapters. So those are the 2 videos we're asking you to watch over the next week. Now, Gavin, you had a couple of comments about some of the discussion questions and responses, and then also the reaction papers.
Yeah. So one of the questions that came up, not a ton, but a couple of times in the discussion questions that I thought was worth addressing was why, or at least according to Wrangham, did females in Homo sapiens not seem to play as big of a role in the domestication process as in bonobos? Because just to remind you guys, the proposed explanation for bonobos' self-domestication relative to chimpanzees is that females of the species were able to sort of stick together while foraging and then protect against attacks by violent males and sort of select the less reactively aggressive males, to the effect that bonobos are less reactively aggressive today than their ancestors likely would have been. And so a couple people are wondering, why doesn't Wrangham give as much stock to this possibility occurring in humans?
So it's a good question. We really haven't gotten into Wrangham's explanation for self-domestication in humans, right? I mean, that'll come in the next several chapters.
Okay.
The short answer is Wrangham. Well, he's given you hints, and he's alluded to his explanation. His explanation, which we'll get to in chapter 7 in a little more detail. His explanation for human self-domestication is what he calls the execution hypothesis. This is the argument that badly behaving males, adult males, and it's particularly males, because males are capable of inflicting, significant physical damage on other males, on other females, on females, and so on. And what Wrangham argues is that, long story short, and we'll get into it in a little bit, what happens is where there are these tyrants, these ne'er-do-wells, these troubling, violent males, psychopaths, basically, who aren't, getting in line and who are basically disrupting the social group. Wrangham argues that adult males band together. They construct coalitions, seek out and essentially execute these tyrannical males. So Wrangham's argument really doesn't turn heavily on, I don't think he excludes the potential role of females, particularly like in mate preferences for less aggressive males or, non-psychopathic, non-narcissistic, non-tyrannical males. I don't think he rules that out, but he certainly does put more weight on adult male coalitions forming to take down a tyrannical male. So I think it's an interesting, there's a few reasons why that might be. First of all, in humans, as in chimpanzees, what you do find, at any rate, what matters is in humans, females typically disperse from the group when they reach reproductive age. That's true in humans, it's true in chimpanzees. I mean, basically, what it means is that most adult females aren't related to one another, right? Most adult females aren't related to one another, and so they don't have that genetic kinship that I think is more common in bonobos. It's similar to what you find in chimpanzees, where it's adult females leaving the natal group and joining other groups where they then go on to mate with and produce offspring by the males in that existing group. That's, again, in humans, it's females that are much more likely to disperse at reproductive age than are males. And that's true cross-culturally, it's true cross-historically. Obviously, there are going to be cross-cultural, cross-historical variations, so it's not 100%, but I mean, it's much more likely to be females dispersing than males. And again, what that means is that you find yourself, if you're an adult female, with adult females to whom you're not genetically related. And that makes the likelihood of cooperation, somewhat less likely. Furthermore, females banding together simply may not have the physical strength and to quiet or to do away with, a large, strong, physically imposing, violent, aggressive, homicidal male. It may require the attention of multiple adult males in humans. So these are all open questions. These are questions that Wrangham addresses as we work through the book. One of the things he does do, however, is he provides very clear evidence that there's very rich evidence dating back thousands of years and across cultures in humans of adult males forming coalitions, to execute tyrannical males. And that has to be accounted for. It's not adult females that are banding together to execute tyrannical males. It's adult males. And so that has to be considered as part of the relevant evidence. So does that help, Gavin?
Yeah, no, I think that is helpful. And another thing I was thinking of while you were talking is, you can imagine that even if females did have a preference for more aggressive, tyrannical, bullying males, the execution hypothesis would still sort of hold more water, I think, because that would killing those men, coalitions of men killing the tyrannical bullies would still sort of outweigh female preference for them because, obviously, if you're dead, you can't reproduce. So,
unless, of course, they already have reproduced.
Right. But so to speak, I think Wrangham is right in giving more weight to the execution hypothesis. So.
Yeah, well, and specifically, because his execution hypothesis is specifically that adult males band together to kill tyrannical males, right?
Yes.
And he brings evidence to bear on this. So, it's overwhelmingly, these coalitionary groups are overwhelmingly adult males. It may have occurred somewhere in the past that they included females. He doesn't bring any evidence to bear on that issue specifically. He doesn't find any. That doesn't mean it's not there. And so, it's about making an argument, and it's about assessing the evidence such as it is. It's not to say that we won't one day find additional evidence that suggests otherwise, but for now, the evidence appears to be pretty clearly in favor of the so-called execution hypothesis and the focus on adult males forming coalitions to oust or execute a tyrannical male. But that's actually a good point that you caused me to think about, which is that, the selection pressure of death is much heavier than the selection pressures of sexual attraction by females for tyrannical behavior. But that presumes, of course, that death occurs before males have reproduced.
Right.
And I don't, I think that's actually an interesting question. The selection pressures would have to be very, very strong indeed in favor of the sexual attraction of tyrannical males. Or if not the sexual attraction, then the sexually coercive abilities of tyrannical males. There would have to be fairly consistent and relatively high rates of sexual coercion or acquiescence to out the costs of execution by coalitions of adult males that have had it with tyrannical behavior. So,
yeah.
Anyways, it remains unknown, and I think it's an interesting question that would be worth thinking about as we read the next several chapters to see if he does address this in particular. I don't recall that he does, but he may. He may say something to that effect. So we'll keep our eyes open for that.
Okay.
So chapter 6, in chapter 6, let me just back up just a tiny bit. So he wraps up chapter 5, if you recall, was his argument that bonobos are self-domesticated. Okay, that female mate preferences select for males who are not tyrannical, who are not aggressive. And female bonobos have the power in bonobo communities. They band together, okay, and can shoo away or otherwise punish, would-be male tyrants. And again, part of the explanation for why that occurred in bonobos and not in chimps is that bonobos don't have to disperse widely. They don't have to go off on their own. Female bonobos don't have to go off on their own and find themselves alone, searching for food, because they are not in competition with gorillas for high-quality food, which, of course, chimpanzees are in competition with gorillas for the high-quality food. And chimpanzees lose in that competition because gorillas are much larger and much stronger. So that leads us to, so his argument from chapter 5 is that wild domesticates, that wild animals can self-domesticate, and indeed did self-domesticate. This is the point of his arguments regarding bonobos, okay, as a self-domesticated species. So then he turns to humans, and chapter 6 is titled Baliev's Rule in Human Evolution. And just to remind you, Baliev's rule, this is the Russian geneticist that successfully domesticated wild foxes, okay, the silver fox. And his rule is that selection against reactive aggression causes a domestication syndrome. Okay, selection against reactive aggression causes a or the domestication syndrome. Okay? Domestication syndrome, in turn, is reflected in high social tolerance, an ability to tolerate, the presence and the interactions, close interactions of many others, and also domestication syndrome reflects a much longer fuse, so not being prone to exploding in rage. He's argued here at the beginning that, and as he says here on page 6, Baliev's rule appears to be so strong that we can use it in reverse by inferring from the presence of a domestication syndrome that a species has undergone selection against reactive aggression. Okay? He wants to argue then that modern Homo sapiens, humans, modern humans, are domesticated. They are self-domesticated. It must be self-domesticated because there is and never has been a domesticator, and all efforts at human domestication by, for example, kings have failed miserably. Okay, so that means they must have been self-domesticated. That means there must have been some strong selection pressure against reactive aggression. Okay? And what Wrangham does is take you through what we know about the evolutionary history of hominids, the evolutionary history leading up to modern Homo sapiens, and he makes the argument with paleoanthropological evidence that early hominids display features, okay, that are more typical of the wild versions of a known domesticated species. So if you look at modern humans' facial structure, skull structure, if you look at the size and width and strength, the robustness of their bones, if you look at the sex differences in terms of size and strength, okay, all of this evidence together suggests that modern humans are once again, a domesticated version of earlier hominids. The sex differences are less pronounced, okay, in large part attributable to males becoming relatively feminized. Okay, the sex differences are less pronounced than, for example, in Homo neanderthalis, in Neanderthals. We have much more what are referred to as gracile bones, less thick, less robust bone structures. Okay, we have larger brains, at least until the last. There's some discussion about the evolution of brain size. What's another piece of that that suggests that modern humans are a domesticated species?
I honestly thought it was smaller brain size.
Well,
but I know it gets tricky because of similar to size overall. It gets smaller until like humans attain a certain amount of nutrition, and then they, body size starts to increase a little bit. But I know we're smaller than Neanderthals in stature.
And in muscle mass and in bone robustness. The reason I'm balking just a little bit at brain size is that, well, first of all, brain size, while typically decreasing with domestication, typically.
Right.
There are exceptions. I believe in several species. For example, in mice, I believe the brain size in domesticated mice is about the same as it is in the wild ancestor of domesticated mice.
Okay.
And there is, what it is I think in the last 30,000 years or so, or something like that, the last couple of dozen thousand years, brain size, here I'm just looking at it right here, it says, let's just look back. I'm looking at page 122 for the moment. And Wrangham is reporting, let's just spend just a moment on brain size, because this is the one place where there's some question about the extent to which modern humans, Homo sapiens, fit the description of domesticated species. He says, so Wrangham says, according to Marian, 3 features of Homo sapiens enabled us to accumulate those kinds of cultural skills. And this is one of the things that clearly sets us apart from other hominids. We are highly intelligent, highly cooperative, and we excel at learning from others, so-called social learning. Now, to judge from brain size, he says, is indicated by the internal volumes of fossil skulls. The intelligence of other mid-Pleistocene species of Homo was close to that of Homo sapiens, but Homo sapiens had the edge. For example, one analysis of 14 fossils from the period of 200,000 to 76,000 years ago finds that the brain volumes of Neanderthals were relatively small. Okay, 8 specimens of Neanderthals averaged 1,272 cubic centimeters compared with 1,535 cubic centimeters in 6 specimens of Homo sapiens. Then he goes on to say, between 75,000 and 27,000 years ago, by contrast, the internal volume of fossil skulls was indistinguishable, averaging 1,473 in both species of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. Then he says, but even if levels of intelligence were somewhat similar across the Homo species, exceptional cooperation and social learning seem to have been unique to Homo sapiens. So he's sort of hinting at some of the less than razor clear evidence for brain size per se as necessarily indicative of domestication. And in fact, I think in the last 30,000 years or so, I think there's evidence for an increase in brain size in Homo sapiens. So something different may be going on altogether with humans, and his argument is that it has to do with the profound effects of cultural evolution and the profound effects of social complexity and the various adaptive problems that modern humans, early humans, archaic Homo sapiens, faced in terms of navigating an extraordinarily complex social environment. So there's more to be known. And let's see. Let me just step back here. So he makes the case that Homo sapiens emerged, that is, modern Homo sapiens emerged somewhere around 300,000 years ago. And he says, based on genetic evidence among living peoples, the ancestors that gave rise to everyone alive today are estimated to have lived between 350,000 and 260,000 years ago. So he puts it at somewhere around 300,000 years ago. And let's see, he notes that refers to archaic Homo ancestors of Homo sapiens as mid-Pleistocene Homo species. These living somewhere in the range of 780,000 years ago to 130,000 years ago. So again, he gives the sort of general rough estimate of about 300,000 years ago for the evolution of modern humans. In other words, it wasn't 10 million years ago, and it wasn't 1,000 years ago. Somewhere around 300,000 years ago. And if you look at the various features of modern humans relative to archaic Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, and Homo habilis, and Homo erectus, many of the features that are relevant for identifying domestication syndrome appear to be displayed in modern humans. And this is the section where he reviews, this is some of the work that he reviews based on a career, basically, by a woman called Helen Leach. And this starts It covers pages 118 and 119. And let's see here. Let me just try to pull out the most crucial sort of evidence here. He says, he's summarizing some of this work. He says, over time, the morphological transitions in the direction of Homo sapiens that are first detectable in the Jebel Irhoud people, that was about 300,000 years ago, became elaborated and intensified. Fossils from everywhere in Africa show that sometime after 200,000 years ago, there were further reductions in the size of the face and brow ridge. Sex differences also diminished as male faces became more feminine. Much later, according to Wrangham, during the Upper Paleolithic, from 40,000 years onward, the whole body also became lighter, okay, to judge by a reduction in the diameter of the femur, the thigh bone. The limbs became less robust in a further way too. They were less bony. The effect is seen in the cross-section of arm and leg bone. The wall of bony cortex that surrounds the marrow-containing cavity became thinner. Then he notes, in the last 35,000 years, sex differences in height and tooth size likewise been reduced. In all these ways, modern Homo sapiens is a less forcefully male species than our ancestors were 300,000 years ago. Our ancestors became feminized. And he goes on to review additional evidence. Here's the section that I was talking about with regard to brain size. You move on to the next page. He says, for the greater part of Homo sapiens' existence, brains did not reduce in size. Instead, they grew larger. Now, he notes there are not enough preserved skulls from the mid-Pleistocene to be sure how big the brains of the earliest Homo sapiens were, but by 300,000 years ago, they were probably 1,200 to 1,300 cubic centimeters, a little less than the average of about 1,330 cubic centimeters in living people. For the next 250,000 years, the brains of Homo sapiens continued to increase in size up to an average of a little more than 1,500 cubic centimeters. Okay. Meanwhile, as the brains of Homo sapiens were slightly increasing in size, their shapes changed also. By 200,000 years ago, their skulls have become increasingly round or globular. Okay. Skipping down just a little bit further, and just forgive the multiple quotes here, but I think it's important, and I think this gives you a sense of this is an area where research is ongoing. Towards the bottom of page 119, he says, eventually, during the last 35,000 years, Homo sapiens experienced a reduction in brain size. Okay, and here's where we're talking about. This piece of evidence here is going to be important in terms of the larger picture that Wrangham is attempting to make here, that modern humans are domesticated. So, during the last 35,000 years, Homo sapiens experienced a reduction in brain size of around 10 to 15% to reach today's levels. Okay? He notes that there's debate about what the reduction in brain size means, especially in light of the fact that we're becoming lighter bodied at the same time. Smaller bones, less dense bones. Nevertheless, this 10 to 15% reduction in brain size is what you do typically find in domesticated species. Okay, it's what you find in sheep, it's what you find in cattle, it's what you find in various species that humans themselves have domesticated. It's also what you find, I believe, in the brain size of bonobos relative to chimpanzees. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, no, I also am not sure whether or not he mentioned that in the last chapter.
I'm not sure that he did. I can't recall. I feel like he did, but it may have been more of in passing. As you can see, the evidence with regard to brain volume, I think it's safe to say it's less clear, and it's more difficult to understand that when you're thinking about the domestication syndrome. Much more straightforward to look at the reduction in sex differences, the reduction in canines, the reduction in bone density. All of this is consistent, very consistent with domestication syndrome, and it's very typical of what you see in modern Homo sapiens relative to archaic Homo sapiens or Neanderthals. So he's sort of pointing at, there may be something to say for understanding modern Homo sapien brain volume reduction alongside the fact that our bones have become significantly less dense. our bodies have become significantly more what's often referred to as gracile rather than robust. But again, I think on balance, I think the pattern of evidence is consistent with humans being a domesticated and therefore a self-domesticated species.
Right.
On balance,
And there are other places where it's a little inconsistent, where, like,
sure.
he mentions the piebalding pattern that doesn't really
True.
show up in humans, the not having floppy ears, but of course bonobos don't really have that either. So there are a few small inconsistencies, but of course, by and large, I think the big one being, at least for me, I think the most convincing one being the reduction in sex differences,
Yes.
such that men become more feminized. I think that's pretty clear evidence that the more hyper-aggressive, hyper-masculine forms were being selected against or removed from the population.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. Okay, let's see. Just moving forward towards the end here of the chapter. Now he notes, in terms of understanding what appears to be the domestication syndrome, for humans, for modern Homo sapiens, he notes there are other explanations, or there may be other explanations for this collection of attributes that describe the domestication syndrome. I mean, it could be the case that each of these features of modern humans independently evolved. The decrease in sex differences, the decrease in canines, the decrease in bone density. I mean, all of this could have been independently selected for. But that's a messier kind of explanation because it depends on multiple independent and different explanations. That's why, if we have nothing else but the current data available, the more parsimonious explanation is that humans indeed are a domesticated and therefore a self-domesticated species. Okay, as we would conclude for bonobos. Now, okay, so he goes on to say, this is on page 126. Some or all of these other issues that I've just mentioned may be relevant, at least to some extent. For instance, a warmer climate might have fostered a more gracile skeleton. Cooking may have led to a decreased jaw and tooth size. But those one-by-one ideas, he says, do not solve the problem that Leach identified. And that problem is, why are the characteristic features of Homo sapiens congruent with the domestication syndrome found in other animals? Okay. Leach's persuasive solution, according to Wrangham, was that the reason that human features are described by the domestication syndrome is simple. Humans are a domesticated species. That's why we have the various features that we do that look a heck of a lot like the features of domesticated species. Then he goes on to say, in Leach's hands, the idea that humans are a domesticated species ran into trouble, however, because she proposed that the process happened very late in our evolution, at a time after many people stopped being nomadic, became sedentary, mostly during the last 10,000 years. This concept not only ignored the evidence of domestication syndrome reaching back to the origins of Homo sapiens, dating back 300,000 years, but also made Aristotle's mistake and implied that some populations of humans, those that have always remained as nomadic foragers, had not undergone domestication. And the evidence is simply not consistent with that. If one group of humans are domesticated, then all groups of humans are domesticated. If you look at the evidence across human populations. A further difficulty of Leach's explanation, according to Wrangham, is the mechanism that she proposed for self-domestication. As he knows, she suggested that once people began building houses, the artificial protective environment, in parentheses, or in quotation marks, would lead to conscious or unconscious interference in breeding. She speculated this would lead to the domestication of plants, animals, and humans, but she did not explain how this would happen, nor did she tie her thinking to Belyev's insight that selection against reactive aggression is the key influence producing domestication. Okay, so what Wrangham argues then is to understand why humans exhibit the domestication syndrome, we have to identify a mechanism. That's crucial. Okay, a specific selective force that could have operated throughout the time of Homo sapiens. And I'm looking at the last paragraph of chapter 6. He says the factor or factors responsible for domestication must apply to our species as a whole, okay, which means it has to go back at least 60,000 years and probably 300,000 years. Okay, the selective force must also to Homo sapiens, not occurring in Homo neanderthalis or in any other species of Homos, because they don't display the domestication syndrome that Homo sapiens display. And most importantly, according to Wrangham, the mechanism must explain how the propensity for reactive aggression is reduced. Okay? Precisely such a mechanism was hinted at by Darwin, Charles Darwin, and has been elaborated by another researcher called Christopher Bem. Their proposal accounts for the emergence of the domestication syndrome in Homo sapiens by reduction of reactive aggression through punishment of reactive aggression imposed by humans on ourselves. That leads us into the introduction of Wrangham's hypothesis, which is the execution hypothesis. Bad news males were killed by coalitions of other adult males. Okay? And this repeated killing of tyrants, coalitional killings of tyrants, over the last 300,000 years produced the domestication syndrome, according to Wrangham's argument. It's a graduate student and I wrote a book review of Wrangham's book called that we titled "Goodness by Execution." So, according to Wrangham, our self-domestication, our domestication, okay, our social tolerance, our cooperativeness, our virtue can be found in our repeated execution of tyrannical males by adult males working together as a coalition. Okay? That leads us then to chapter 7, the tyrant problem. So before Wrangham argues that, for this execution hypothesis, he has to make the case that tyrannical males could have been a problem and may well have been a problem, and in fact were a problem for much of our evolutionary history. Okay? A problem that had to be addressed.
Right. And I mean, so I feel like there's a couple different ways to look at that, and I don't want to get too ahead into chapters we haven't read yet, but I mean, on the one hand, there must have been some sort of removal of these individuals from the group, assuming that individuals who had the physical characteristics more hypermasculine and more aggressive people also displayed those same behavioral characteristics, and because those people are no longer in the population, they must have been removed somehow. And I don't think it's reasonable to suggest that they were removed by environmental, non-human pressures. So, on the one hand, it leaves that. On the other hand, I think, doesn't Wrangham review evidence from tribal and traditional human populations that suggests behaviorally that there is just a low tolerance for individuals who do not gel with the group or adhere to group norms, etc. But within those who do adhere to group norms and do sort of get along with one another, there's very little sort of button pushing within the group.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what Wrangham is arguing, and that's exactly the evidence it's part of the evidence that he brings to bear. I mean, we should be clear that this is a hypothesis. The execution hypothesis is Wrangham's hypothesis for the selection pressures against reactive aggression that produced domestication in humans, right? I mean, he may be wrong. Okay? And there may be, as the evidence accumulates, as future researchers test, this hypothesis, which I think, is what must be done, it may turn out to be wrong. I think at this point, Wrangham's intent is to simply present a defensible hypothesis for, the selection pressure that produced domestication in humans. He's, laying his bet on execution of tyrannical males by coalitions of adult males, okay, by removing them from the population. And if you remove them from the population, well, then assuming they haven't had opportunities to breed with reasonably high frequency, then the genes that built those tyrannical males will themselves be removed from the population, resulting in a population of males in particular, but also of females, that are relatively more docile, that are relatively less likely to be reactively aggressive. Because if they were reactively aggressive, they're executed. Okay? And any offspring that those reactively aggressive people would have had they not been executed, are here.
Right. Right.
So in many ways, it's a very simple kind of hypothesis. He takes us through some of the history of, some of the thinking about tyrannical males and the execution of tyrannical males. And, he points out that Darwin himself in 1871 was very close to proposing precisely this hypothesis. And as he mentions on, he actually argues that the execution hypothesis can be traced to Darwin, which is surprising, he says, given that Darwin considered that self-domestication had not occurred in humans. Recall, Wrangham says, that Darwin asked himself whether humans had gone through an evolutionary phase of becoming domesticated, and he had decided, that is, Darwin had decided, the answer was no. He said no breeding programs had ever been attempted, nor could they be successful, or would they be successful. And so therefore, Darwin sort of short-sightedly said, well, it can't be the case that humans were domesticated, even though he saw the evidence suggesting that they sort of seemed domesticated, but he couldn't get his head around how that could have occurred. At least not, he couldn't put two and two together, because he also independently argued that tyrannical males would have frequently met the fate of death by those, particularly adult males who were tired of putting up with this individual. So he was almost there. He just didn't connect, execution of tyrannical males with the apparent domestication of humans. Like he was stuck saying humans can't have been domesticated. That can't be right, because there was no domesticator.
Right.
So he was close. He was also much more focused on explaining human morality rather than explaining human relatively low reactive aggression. And because he was more interested in explaining human morality, he was especially interested in not relying on attributing that morality to God. Because remember, when Darwin was writing, the widespread presumption was that God accounted for all of the apparent design in nature. And, Darwin's first line of argument was that a supernatural designer, is not necessary to explain the appearance of apparent design in nature. It doesn't require a God, to supernaturally poof things into existence. Darwin wanted to argue that apparent design evolves over time, little by little, bit by bit. And so that you got to remember, that's what Darwin has in mind, is he's working against, he's attempting to argue that you don't need a designer, you don't need a God, okay? While at the same time, he argues that what is most interesting about humans is our moral sense. And that put him, at risk of being, he found himself in a position of having to say, well, it can't be because of God, because I already ruled out God. So our moral sense can't be attributable to God. And so he ended up spending more of his time thinking about our moral sense and our cooperative sense and our interest in caring for others, rather than the sort of flip side, which is our dramatically decreased reactive aggression. So all of which to say, I think he successfully, muddled himself up enough that he couldn't link a history of executing tyrannical males, which he was aware of, and selecting against reactive aggression to produce what appeared to be a domesticated species.
Right. Even though he seemed to have been rather close. I mean, Wrangham
Yeah.
himself references Darwin a few times throughout this chapter, and I think even ends by quoting him in
Yeah.
Darwin's quote that, what was it, bloody and quarrelsome men came to a bloody end, or something like that.
Right. So he was there. He was right there. I think the major problem is that Darwin had already ruled out the possibility that humans were domesticated.
Right. So he couldn't also have brought himself to, favor the execution hypothesis, because that's sort of the mechanism for that.
Yeah, I mean, and he never, he just sort of, he left it as a grotesque contradiction of sorts. Although now we see it, 2020 hindsight, we see the contradiction that Wrangham has brought to the front. But I must say that, I've read his 1871 book. We've read some of his previous books, and I myself never noticed. I never noticed that contradiction. So at any rate, there's one place where where Wrangham specifically notes the contradiction that I'm referring to. I want to see what wording he uses here. Let me know if you find it. You know what I'm talking about, where he says Darwin never noticed this contradiction, or he seems not to have. Still looking here.
It's not at the bottom of page 130, is it? Apparently, the great evolutionist never noticed this inconsistency. He described morality as having.
Where is that?
Bottom of page 130. It's like at the bottom of that paragraph too.
Okay, yes, perfect. So he says, all right, so looking at that paragraph, the beginning of that paragraph, Darwin's writings on this topic reveal a remarkable contradiction. Yes, I want to just make sure we put a pin on this since we've spent some time on it. In Chapter 4 of The Descent of Man, that was published in 1871, he denied that human self-domestication could have happened because human, quote, breeding has never long been controlled either by methodical or unconscious selection. So he's kind of stuck. He painted himself into a corner. But in Chapter 5 of the same book, he proposed that what he called the evolution of social instincts, which is clearly closely equivalent to self-domestication, okay, and he included morality, could have happened when the breeding of aggressive men was socially controlled, whether by imprisonment or by execution. Darwin's consideration of human self-domestication thus included both an explanation for its core feature of reduced aggressiveness in Chapter 5 and a rejection of it happening at all in Chapter 6. Apparently, the great evolutionist never noticed this inconsistency. He described morality as evolving as a result of reduced aggression, but he did not think of domestication in this same way. His confusion is understandable. Almost a century was to pass before Baliev's experiments showed that selection against reactive aggression is the key to producing a domesticated animal. I might as well finish this next paragraph. Still, even though Darwin did not recognize the significance of his own idea about execution, in thinking about morality, he had produced a stark and simple notion that readily applies to the problem of self-domestication. Selection favored moral behavior thanks to the, quote, bloody end of, quote, violent and quarrelsome men, end quote. Extreme violence, says Wrangham, had thus been selected against. The trend had continued long enough, Darwin surmised, to have favored, quote, the social instincts. Then, wrapping this up, he says, thanks to Darwin, human docility reduced reactive aggressiveness, that is, domestication, had the start of an evolutionary explanation, the first version of the execution hypothesis, despite the fact that Darwin himself never realized he was producing it.
Right.
Then Wrangham spent some time sort of addressing and discarding the parochial altruism hypothesis. as a sort of would-be alternative to the execution hypothesis. The parochial altruism hypothesis, Wrangham notes, argued why cooperation was favored, while the execution hypothesis proposed why aggression was reduced. Okay, so parochial altruism doesn't address, the execution of tyrannical males as a path to reduced reactive aggression. What the parochial altruism hypothesis addresses is the cooperative behavior that we see already in existence. So it doesn't offer much of an alternative hypothesis.
Right, because even if it tried to explain, even if it did a good job of explaining how cooperation could be favored, it would also have to somehow explain, and it doesn't, how more reactively aggressive and therefore probably less cooperative individuals would have been bred out of the population. And as Wrangham sort of argues, without those people being forcibly removed, they continue to have the opportunities to bully individuals and sort of muscle their way in on the fruits of the labor of the more cooperative group members. So I don't know if that's a helpful way to put it, but just sort of noting that Wrangham's intent here in this chapter, I think, is to hold up the execution hypothesis as being, the most likely mechanism by which these individuals could have been removed, and I think that's sort of important.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I can imagine that the advocates of the parochial altruism hypothesis would like to rebut some of what Wrangham has written, and that's fine. I mean, that's what science is about. I mean, Wrangham is in the business now of presenting the reader with his arguments for why the execution hypothesis is the best explanation so far, okay, for domestication in humans, for decreased reactive aggression in humans, and therefore domestication of humans, self-domestication. Then Wrangham then moves to discussing the crucial importance of reputation in humans. He points out, some of the work by Richard Alexander, an evolutionary biologist, who also struggled in the 1970s and 1980s with understanding human cooperation. And Wrangham notes that, on page 135, he says, explaining humans' extremely high cooperative tendencies has garnered more attention than explaining our strikingly low reactive aggression, but eventually the aggression problem is taken up again. 3 decades before Bowles and colleagues proposed that self-sacrifice in war is the root of human goodness by virtue of the parochial altruism hypothesis, evolutionary biologist Richard Alexander proposed that reputation is the key. Although Alexander did not raise any questions about humans' reduced reactive aggression, his scenario would lead back to Darwin's focus on violent and quarrelsome men. Alexander's question was how to favor the evolution of a kindly morality. And Alexander brought a bright light to the issue of reputation, of what, among humans, of the importance of what other people think of you, what other people expect of you, okay, and what other people say about you. Wrangham reveals some of the evidence that chimpanzees don't appear to be concerned with reputation. They don't appear to be concerned who is watching them do what. Okay, where that's it's very different in humans. Okay, as Wrangham notes, chimpanzees can't talk about one another behind one another's back. Humans can, and Wrangham notes that gossip surrounds us, so we care about our reputations. We know that people are more likely to give to charity or to clean up a mess when they are being watched than when they are alone. We're incredibly sensitive to what other people think or might think about us. Alexander's idea, therefore, was that the social pressures wrought by the effects of a good or bad reputation underlie the evolution of morality. Okay? These are the selection pressures that built a psychology of morality, okay? Being concerned about what other people think or might say about you to other people. Okay? And hence the importance of language. Language begat reputation, or reputation begat morality, according to Alexander's argument, with which Wrangham agrees. And then he goes on to ask, Wrangham asks, why would a bad reputation matter to a male who let me back up. Why would a bad reputation matter to a male who was bold and strong enough to take matters into his own violent hands? And he goes on to argue, in short, that it would matter if you could be subject to the ire of a coalition of males seeking to get rid of you if you don't get in line. Okay? And one strong male cannot defend himself against, 6, 8, 10 moderately strong males.
Right.
He does address, I just stumbled upon top of page 139. Let's see here. So he goes on to say, let me just finish that thought about reputation. He says, how would this bad reputation have inhibited him if, like an alpha chimpanzee, he did not care what others thought? This would be the tyrannical male. The apes have not evolved to be sensitive to social disapproval. Reactive aggression is much more readily provoked among chimpanzees than among humans. Until we evolved our calmer dispositions, we would have behaved more like those apes. There would have been a lot of fighting, and the strongest, toughest, most persistent fighters would have won. A female might have preferred a kinder, gentler male as a mate, but how was she to stop a domineering male from coercing her? More tolerant men might provide more meat, but what would prevent a powerful individual who was willing to throw his weight around from refusing to be denied? Aggressively seizing more than his share. Tyrants who did not care about their reputations could bully their way to getting more than others. Whether more food, more matings, the best sleeping spot, or more social support, that is what happens among chimpanzees, among mid-Pleistocene Homo, who was to stop the despots. Then he goes on to say, at top page 139, shunning would be insufficient to affect an individual who is able to intimidate and defeat all others in a fight. Subordinates, resentment could be translated to effective resistance only with force. Cooperation among the weaker individuals is needed. Okay, could early Homo females have similarly ganged up on the alpha male to stop him when he asserted himself too selfishly? And then Wrangham notes, despite its logical appeal, this hypothesis is improbable. And then he gives the reasons for why this hypothesis is improbable. Notably, among hunter-gatherers, men are important as providers of food and protectors, and women compete with one another to become the wives of the best husbands. There are no such dividing forces among female bonobos. And those dividing forces make cooperation more difficult. Let's see. He does go on to say, let's see. Even among today's men. Okay, hold on. Wrangham notes that the difficulty with the reputation hypothesis is that it does not explain why such tendencies would have been reduced, that is, reactive aggression. Physical aggressors could have succeeded in bullying their way to the top. The same challenge faces all ideas for explaining the evolution of human goodness that do not address the control of aggression. Okay? He goes through a series of other potential explanations, but he argues that none of them solves the problem of domineering aggressors, even if a man's hunting success was feeble, because no one would hunt with him. If he was sufficiently aggressive, he could commandeer the prey killed by others. This leads Wrangham to propose in the final paragraph of page 141 the only proposal sufficient to explain how our ancestors overcame the problem of determined bullies, which was surely a first vital step to elaboration of cooperative behavior, is the elaboration of Darwin's idea that, quote, violent and quarrelsome men came to a bloody end. The execution hypothesis claims that during the Pleistocene, a new kind of ability crystallized. For the first time, coalitions of males became effective at deliberately killing any member of their social group who was prepared to use violence on his own behalf and simply did not care what others thought about him. In the end, execution was the only way to stop such a male from being a tyrant. So, what Wrangham has done here is he's made an effort to argue that while there's merit in several of these alternative or related hypotheses, notably Alexander's reputation hypothesis, none of them squarely address how you deal with a domineering male who doesn't care about reputation. Wrangham proposes that the execution hypothesis does. Okay? It's coalitions of males banding together to rid the community of a tyrannical male who won't stop.
Right. And, I think it's also worth noting, and I'm not sure if you read it in one of the quotes, but just how really no other option would have been viable for ancestral or traditional human societies other than execution would be the only way. Ostracism wouldn't work if they're already bullies and if they already throw their weight around in other situations.
And they don't care.
Then there's no reason to assume that social shunning would be sufficient. Or in jailing isn't really an option in those situations either.
Yeah, and lifetime jailing is a fairly modern. No, it is a modern phenomenon. I mean, historically and cross-culturally among hunter-gatherer tribes and among non-Western peoples, they don't jail people for life; they just kill them.
Right.
One could argue, well, it's the same thing, but that's true, except that just killing them requires, dealing with it once and being done with it.
Right, and especially for nomadic people who are moving around.
Yeah, good point. Absolutely. So the next step now, he's introduced this idea, and in the next chapter called Capital Punishment, he's going to make the case that capital punishment, that is execution, has been a recurrent feature of our evolutionary history, of human evolutionary history. It's not something new. It's not something modern. It's not something novel. It's not something peculiar to the West. Execution, particularly execution of tyrannical males, has occurred, for as long as we have any kind of record, whether that record is written or logical. The record, he's going to argue, the evidence suggests that humans have recurrently, that is, over the course of our evolutionary history, executed tyrannical males. Okay, so he's going to make that case in the next chapter. And he's going to begin to address some of the consequences. Okay, in the next chapter, in chapter 9, which we'll discuss next week, what domestication did, he will begin to sort of lay out the consequences of the execution. In particular, provide a little richer background for what it means to be domesticated.
Yeah, and I think in that chapter he'll also get into more of, because we skimmed it a little during this discussion, but he'll get more in depth in, I think, our ability to cooperate and cultural, social learning in that chapter as well, as a result of, the execution hypothesis and self-domestication.
Yes, absolutely. Which reminds me, all the more reason to, or it makes the Harari talk, I think, that much more valuable, to appreciate, the extent to which we cooperate and are socially tolerant of one another. It's so obvious that I think it's, you don't really think about it until someone points it out. And so I think Harari does a really nice job of pointing out how extraordinary our cooperativeness is. Our ability to work in large groups, okay, toward a common goal is all but unique. And I think it's worth appreciating, that really is a distinctive feature of Homo sapiens. So anyways, yeah, he will go on, and he'll, in particular, he's going to repeatedly discuss modern humans with what he argues is the best we can do right now with what we know about Homo neanderthalis, Neanderthals. Okay. All right. Anything else, Gavin?
No, I think that about does it for me.
Okay. So we will pick this back up again for chapters 8 and 9 for next week.
Okay, sounds good.
Very good. Thanks, Gavin. Take care.